I realized last night that while we're celebrating taking note of the fact that the journal is now 50 years old, I think we haven't said enough about another fact, which is that the collective, which has been running the journal for the last many years, is also celebrating an anniversary of kind. It's 35 years, almost. We're cheating just a little bit. 35 years since the collective became the guiding editorial body of the journal, which in turn led to the expansion of the journal, the creation of other categories on the masthead, an editorial board, a group of advisory editors. More recently, the restoration of assistant editors is a place for us to help some younger people who are interested in this kind of work find their first steps in the profession. So I think it's really important to note that fact. I also noticed that yesterday, filled as it was with astonishingly good talk, none of the talk, that great talk, came from any of the original members of the editorial collective. And today, by contrast, and I admit with a certain sad feeling in my heart, I noticed that there are two of the original founding members of the collective who are going to speak. That is to say, Jonathan Arick in a moment or two after Lindsay Waters, and then after lunch, Don Pease. So all of the other founding members are either unable to be here for reasons of health, Michael Hayes, for example, or because they're no longer with us. Joe Buttigieg, whose name's been mentioned many times. So and this is something like the 72nd meeting of this kind that the collective has convened. And I'm absolutely certain that at the first such meeting, all of the founding members of the collective were there to speak. But with the passage of time, things change. So I wanted to just honor the collective, if I could, for a moment. Today, this morning, we have two speakers, the first of whom is Lindsay Waters, for whom really nothing needs to be said. Stathis Gurgouris and I yesterday spent 5 minutes in that space over there trying to remind our dear friend that he is indeed Lindsay Waters. And that nothing more needs to be said on that topic.
It can't escape.
Can't escape that fact and needs to not worry about the fact itself. So for those of you who may not know, Lindsay was for many years, before his recent retirement, the executive editor for the Humanities at Harvard University Press, where I believe you began in 1984.
Don't forget Minnesota.
I haven't forgotten Minnesota. I'm working backward to your youth. Yeah, backward to your youth. This is a Bildungsroman of a poor kind. But before 84, from 78 to 84, in turn, he was an editor at the University of Minnesota Press, where, along with Vlad Godzic and one or two others, he produced one of the most significant moments and events in modern academic humanities, that is the Theory, History, and Literature series, the THL series, which brought into the U.S. almost entirely through translation from Western Europe fundamental and crucial documents which supported, inaugurated, and substantiated much of the theory movement in the United States. He has two books that I am aware of. In Chinese, in Putonghua, a book entitled Against Authoritarian Aesthetics. His efforts in recent years have been to try to bring together aesthetics as his concern and interest with aesthetics, which, unlike mine, include the discussions of popular culture. He's working on that book now. I urge him to finish it. His other published book is called Enemies of Promise, Publishing, Perishing, and the Eclipse of Scholarship, which is 2004. And Stathis and I yesterday were urging him, among other things, to remember that he's Lindsay Waters, and that means he is alone capable of writing a memoir of academic intellectual life and publishing in the last 30 years. No one could be better positioned. Today, that Lindsay Waters will speak to us again with the title, Still Enmired, not admired, Enmired, in the age of incommensurability.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. I can't really summarize all the thanks I feel for, and I better not waste any of my time hemming and hawing. Okay, so, because I have no idea how long this talk is going to take, except Don tells me it's going to end at, he told me, but there's a clock on here, but I don't know how to make it work. All right, life makes sense looking backward. Where did I put my water? Life makes sense looking backward, not forward. Like many people my age, I turn to the obits page of the newspaper first. I have also, these days, skipped ahead to the final volume of Proust's Remembrances of Things Past, Time Regained. What a sight Madame Verdurin, the Duchesse de Guimont, makes, her hair scarlet and her salmon-like flesh strangled in jewels, looking like some ancient jewel-bedecked fish. There at her party, as on the obits page, we encounter again many of our oldest friends. My oldest friend. Am I really her oldest friend? And Marcel's oldest friends. In Volume 7, the narrator reflects that it has been a long time since he had seen many of the personages with whom his novel had been occupied. It takes Marcel a long time to recognize that many of them, like Bloch, whom he had, it's not the Frankfurt Critic Bloch, like Bloch, whom he at last recognized, he now completely lacked the vigor of youth. Marcel says, I had known him on the threshold of life when we were schoolfellows. That's back when Boundary 2 was begun. Unconsciously, Marcel realized that he still regarded him as though they were both living in the period of their youth. I was surprised to notice some familiar signs of it in his face. Then, he says, I realized that, in fact, he was old, and that life makes old men out of adolescents who last many years, if they're lucky. It might be sad to realize that what gets lost to us as time marches on, but still for Marcel, there is a gain. Says the narrator, the cruel discovery I had now made regarding the lapse of time could only enrich my ideas. Like a good graduate student, he's quickly coming up with an idea to recast his manuscript and add to the material of my book. Always add to the material of your book. He says, certain people's hair had turned white. Can you believe it? Many people could be immediately identified, but many of them could not. One very nice surprise he notices is that when I conversed with men and women who had formerly seemed and were unbearable, I discovered that they had almost entirely lost their defects. With age, such individuals seem to have acquired a different personality. I'm one of 9, and we just lost one of us last year, my sister Claudia. And in that last year of her life, her personality changed incredibly. And instead of being the person that she was before, she was a bit of a challenge. She had become a very loving, sweet person. Looking back at old age has its benefits, Marcel says. I knew very well that my brain was a rich mineral basin where there was an enormous and most varied area of precious deposits. But he worried, should I have time to exploit them? And if I work on that book that Paul and we've been talking about, will I have time to do it? His new concern, Marcel's new concern, was if I still have the strength to accomplish my work. Sometimes it seems to me philosophy outpaces literature. Stadis and I were having an interesting discussion the other night about which one comes first, philosophy or literature. Who gets to the great ideas first, the great words first? And I think, anyway, Proust's portrayal of the value of retrospection in literature came nearly a century after Hegel had made the case for retrospection in his Phenomenology of Spirit. Robert Brandam's Spirit of Trust has just come out in 2019, and it has very much makes the case for retrospection. I am lucky to have published in a number of excellent books in my final years at HUP. I have a shelf, and it's all the treasures of the last few years, and among those treasures are Paul's book and Brandam's book, both products of the Cathedral of Learning in Pittsburgh, the home of Boundary 2. I am lucky to have published a number of excellent books in my final years at HUP. I'm just repeating myself here. I am so happy to hear, I bet it was great to hear two of my younger authors, Christian and David, speak yesterday. I think I made good choices there. Two of my titans, Beauvais and Brandam, both published books this last year. As I said, it seems that philosophy leads, but sometimes it seems clear to me that, however, that literature really leads. Proust wants us to get ourselves in a position where we can reflect on our lives retrospectively, just as certainly as Hegel wants us to do the same. Hegel believes that when we reflect on our lives, if our lives have featured any experiences, I hope for all of us that they have, those experiences will be of our falling into error. Big entry in the index of Brandam's book on Hegel. All of Paradise Lost is about error. One poet who captured humans falling into error and thereby, I need to stick to my text, and thereby gaining experience was John Milton. Milton had a huge impact on European literature, and it's safe to imagine his impact on Hegel was large. On this occasion, at this time, if I turn my gaze, I need to watch the time here. What time is it right now? 10:21. Because I'm going to keep having to try to urge myself to go faster. On this occasion, at this time, if I turn the gaze of my mind upon myself and B2, the best of my contributions to B2, I think the best of them is my 2001 essay, The Age of Incommensurability, and the second would be my essay on Edward Said from 1998. I feel now the necessity to be retrospective and introspective, necessary to figure out where I have made mistakes and errors. Errors is the word that Hegel used, according to Brandam in his Spirit of Trust. There are some general points I could make about my essay on incommensurability, but a more important preliminary point to make it in service to this effort to conduct an introspective analysis, and that point is that I tend to quarrel with my authors I publish, or simply have the occasion to listen to. So, and I write about that. So I've written a number, and each of I'm going to talk about three writers, and each of them I have, attacked savagely. I've attacked quite a bit. I've written essays, and you might say, people really don't wander from your notes, Lindsay. It's just going to confuse everybody, including yourself. I'm not sure this whole talk is worth others listening to, but Paul insisted I persist trying to write something new for this conference. He wouldn't let me beg off, so here I am palavering. I love the Portuguese word palavra. meaning speech, specifically the talk between the Portuguese and the West African natives. My incommensurability essay for Boundary 2 led to the greatest number of interesting written responses. I have been tempted to think it was the best thing that I did for Boundary 2. It may be, but to enter into the spirit of a full disclosure in my retrospective, I should not quit while I'm winning, while I think I'm winning. I will address the errors I made and failures, not just in Boundary 2, but throughout my life, to give a full accounting in the spirit, perhaps, of Proust's Volume 7 or Paul de Man's Balancing of Blindness and Sight. What I want to call to your attention are the many times I have attacked my own authors. You might say, hold on, are you saying that you, as an editor, criticize the writings of your own authors, the very people whose books you were aiming to publish or had already published? I know that sounds weird, but consider that I was an editor and I had many book manuscripts to review and read and possibly publish a few of them. I frequently found that I did not have time to read anything else other than those books. The situation is worse. I really had to devote my energy to the reading of manuscripts that I would end up not publishing. If a manuscript was not really good, and I could see that, if a manuscript was really good and I could see that right away, my job was to move it along to the editorial committee and then to the board of syndics as quickly as I could. The press was not paying me to enjoy myself reading these manuscripts. So I had to spend my time with the marginal cases. So I devoted my energy to the problem cases. So this part of my essay is about my disobedience, my dissing several of my leading authors. Stanley Fish, Richard Rury, and Bernard Williams. Such dissing of superiors and authorities can be a dangerous thing to do when people are your academic superiors. And some of these people would remind you of that. I'm going to come to a case, so don't get ahead of myself. Especially if you live in a hierarchically organized institutions like the university. I am a good boy, but I have a predilection to disobey. That's what I did in my own when I was in Catholic college. I attended, and I fell in love with Milton's poetry. My professor hated Milton because he was a regicide and a Protestant who portrayed love between humans in such a pornographic way. Clothes off, Hugh Hefner would blush. In 1998, I was invited back to the Catholic College from which I'd graduated in 1969. And what? Speaking of time. Okay, 10:26. You just every once in a while tell me it's okay. I was invited back to my Catholic college from which I'd graduated in 1969, and I told the story of my battle with my very orthodox and most brilliant professor. When I was invited back to give this talk, the Distinguished Alumnus speech, I thought, should I just go there and say, oh man, it was a great time, and it was the 60s, and it was very wonderful. And I thought, that'll be boring. Can't do that. So I talked about the big fight I had with Professor Fortin, the one who hated Milton. I'd been invited back by the professor who taught Chaucer. Well, so in the spirit of the Wife of Bath, talk permeated my lecture as much as I could make it, and not John Donne's sermons, which is what my professor would have wanted. In other words, disobedience to God, the Father, was the order of the day in the story I told. And disobedience is the rule in all the tales that I'm going to tell you about my betraying my authors. All right, so I'm talking about three people primarily, but I'm going to have a slight digression here at the beginning. One of my masters, whom I disobeyed, has a connection to one of our fellow editors at Boundary 2, David Columbia. You can't be sure when you're when what what you think is a good thing to do is actually disobedient to somebody else. What I found was that I loved David's book on computation, but my professor at the University of Virginia was angry at me for publishing it. He was so angry at me doing that he this is the guy who he had me do a hunk of his Byron edition. He had me, there was a few other things that were a little questionable. So he was upset about the Columbia book, and I didn't understand why. One day I'm going to the MLA, and there's those escalators, and I could see that there was an up escalator and a down escalator, and I was going, I don't know which direction I was going, but Jerry McGann was going the other way, but he looked like he was ready to kill somebody. Well, he wanted to kill me. And when I got back to the Harvard Press booth, he screamed and yelled at me, and for the whole world to see and hear that I was the worst student he had ever had. So it wasn't a Chris Rock kind of thing, or who's the guy who tried to smack Chris Rock? I'm trying to forget that guy. So that was an interesting experience. A much clearer case of my betraying an author of mine is my writing an essay to attack a book by Richard Rury that I had published called Achieving Our Country. From the moment Rury told me his plans for the Massey lectures that we were bound to publish at the Harvard University Press, I had a problem with the book that the lectures would become. I remember lunch with him in Harvard Square back in the old upstairs of the Pudding, way over Harvard Bookstore and Mass Ave and Widener Library. Rury told me his plans was to revivify leftist thought. Well, that's good. But he said he wanted to, but how? He was going to do it by telling people about the glories of 30s leftism, and especially he was going to focus on the work of Daniel Bell. Now, I actually liked Daniel Bell a lot. Daniel Bell was on our board of syndics. Daniel Bell spent a lot of time trying to fix me up and make me suitable for Harvard University, and so he was very kind to me. But however, when Rury said he was going to go back to Daniel Bell to be the model of a intellectual for the present time, I think I laughed at him. I said that you must be joking. I mean, that's not Daniel Bell isn't a person from this generation. That's not going to make sense. Now, eventually, let's see. Lindsay, it's always dangerous to get away from your text, because when you do, you lose your way. As Rury gave the talks, I became more and more dissatisfied. Eventually, my negative reaction took the form of an essay I published attacking Rury's book called Dreaming with Tears in My Eyes, and it was in this journal, Transition. And I thought a much better model intellectual for him would have been Tupac Shakur. But I don't think Rury had heard of Tupac Shakur. But we put lots of pictures of him in here. And one interesting thing is that once again, don't leave your text. You'll lose your way. But Rury said that the left should give up its theory habit. Well, that's like telling me to quit because of my THL series and things like that. Another thing was he talked so much about becoming a patriotic American, I began to think that he sounded like this guy. We have a picture of him in here. The Yankee Doodle. And actually, so what? When I finished a draft of my essay, I sent it to Rury, thinking maybe if he hates it, I won't publish it because it would really be wrong of me to do that. And I waited weeks for him to respond. I was talking a lot to Mantia de Owara in those days, and Mantia said, he must hate you. He must really be angry at you. So finally, the people at this magazine, Transition, said, you gotta get off the pot or move along the road here. So we have to print your essay or not. So I called Rury and I said, did you really hate the essay? And he said, I didn't understand a word you wrote. So, which was kind of interesting because later that year, now I don't have that picture here. Later that year, there was a Halloween party at Stanford, and Zepp Gumbrecht had a party, and Rury came to the party dressed as the Yankee Doodle. right out of this magazine. And so if he didn't understand it, he somehow got it, emotionally, physically. Okay, I think, where are we now? He did read it. All these three cases I'm talking to you about are complicated. Not a single straightforward response. But you live in a university. You know there are not very many people who talk straight here. Not a single straightforward response from the authors I attacked. I'll grant you, it'd be a little bit weird to have your editor attack you. But nonetheless. Another book I'm happy and proud that I published, although I deeply distrusted its contents, is Stanley Fish's How Milton Works. I paid a campus visit to Fish at the University of Illinois at Chicago in the year 2000, and he wanted me to read over every single glorious page of it with him. It was about 700 manuscript pages. And he wanted to get my response to those, to all those pages. We went through every single page, and well, he speaks so forcefully and so on. I just bowled over. And also, he didn't change a single word. The manuscript was 540 pages long. The book is 616 pages long, and the book ended up being longer than the manuscript. In the manuscript and in the book, in the preface on page 7, Fish brags that although he's been working on this book since 1973, nearly 30 years, he's never changed his mind about any of his thinking that has found its way into the cloth-bound book 29 years later. To Fish, I say, I first read Fish Surprised by Sin in 1971, and I'm proud to say that I have not changed my valuation of Fish's book either. I still think it's all wrong. But reading Milton for the first time in 1967 was a key event in my aesthetic education. I responded to the poem deeply because, not to Fish's book, to the poem deeply because of the beauty of the language, the poetry, and I was shocked positively by the auditory and imaginary pornography. American Irish Catholics like me, my family, I guess mine might be a little bit different from Don's, I don't know. We were talking about this the other day. Like my family, we're more hostile to the flesh than most Americans. Rather, actually, than most humans. So when I took a course on Milton at the University of Chicago in 1970 and wrote a paper on Paradise Lost, I criticized Stanley Fish, whose Surprised by Sin had just appeared a few years earlier. I said that Fish says that we must make the garden, 1037, we must make the Garden of Eden into a sensual place that is very sexy, and that it is another, Fish says that when we do that, it's another indication that we have perverted minds. I think Fish is wrong. I remember feeling very uncertain about what I wrote in that essay, but I didn't actually care. It was, after all, 1969 or 1970. This was how I felt about Milton and literature. If I flunked out of being out of graduate school because I liked Paradise Lost and fought with Professor Fish, so be it. If Professor Murren, that was the professor I had then, if he disapproved, I was willing to take take the consequences. I was shooting from the hip and for the moon. And my Professor Murren was no hippie. He was one of the strictest and youngest profs at the University of Chicago. I'm convinced that the A that he gave me is what got me admitted into the PhD program and out of and beyond the terminal MA program that I was in. I still have the paper that with the Murren's comments on it. So like Fish, I know when I enunciated my views on Milton and that I stuck with them, just like he did. So I'm in that way he's a good leader for me. What I said about Milton and Fish then in 1969, in the relative privacy of graduate school program, I took public when I wrote about Fish in Enemies of Promise, where I attacked Fish's book, How Milton Works, which I had published. Really, what kind of a publisher is this? It turns out there's a kind of justice in the world, kind of. I published Fish's book. It got lots of reviews in prominent places, and it sold extremely well. But as the reviews flooded in, I kept thinking the reviews were positive, and I never read any of them. Except the one by Frank Kermode in the Sunday New York Times. And at the end of it, he says, the first part of it is all attacking it, and at the end he says, well, but this is a distinguished book, and it will be the center of Milton studies for a long time to come. But what seemed interesting to me was that what Kermode was saying was that Fish can analyze prose really well. He just can't analyze poetry. But Fish is a professor of poetry, supposedly. Skelton's poetry, maybe. But he is at his best when this is Kermode. He is at his best when there is a prose argument to examine or confute. Fine, but this is a damning judgment on a scholar like Fish, who has devoted himself to studying poetry. Poetry is much more challenging to size up and talk about than prose. Everyone knows that. Maybe somebody wants to argue with me about that. So it's not really funny at all that Fish said early on in his career that if you fall for that poetry of Milton's writing, you've betrayed God, and you are a sinner and you're damned. Fish argues that Milton wants to force the reader to doubt the correctness of his response. If Fish wants you to doubt your response, not the correctness of it wasn't even at issue. He wants us to discount the effect of the speech through a kind of mathematical cancellation. Was Fish a pioneer of cancel culture? Probably was, actually. It turned out when I finally got around to reading the many reviews of Fish's book received last week, and which I had them all neatly packaged up in a box, and which I thought were positive, Fish did not get a pass from the reviewers. They really hated his book, but it didn't make any difference. They all were critical and highlighted the way in which Fish distorted the evidence. Whenever he found something that was really causing him trouble, he would declare that it was un-Miltonic. That sounds like something in recent American politics to me. Fake criticism, we might say, or he might say. In fact, when he was distorting what Milton wrote, to lead to the conclusions he wanted to have, he talked just like Donald Trump. These are fake lines people claim to find in Milton. Really there. If Milton writes lines that don't fit his conclusions, he declares them un-Miltonic. It was a very strange 3 days I spent in Fish's company in April 2000. I used to think that I had big I like Stanley Fish amazingly. But let's see here. Okay. We're getting closer. I'm probably going to end on time. Can you believe it? Let's see. My third case of authors I've published and then gone on to attack in print is Bernard Williams, whose work I attacked in an essay I published in Boundary 2, The Age of Incommensurability. The third case is very different because this author reacted very differently after I attacked him than Rury and Fish did. Williams was hostile to me and dismissive and belittled me. Well, you can see why he was angry if I tell you that I accused him of articulating the philosophy at the heart of white identity politics. I did. Two books of Williams are at issue. One is Ethics and the Limits of Philosophy, which I published in 1986, and the second is Shame and Necessity, which came out from California in 1993. The first is I think Williams did not intend to give philosophical backbone to the white supremacy thinking, but there's no other way to take his book. He didn't say out loud, but it was implicit in what he wrote. His position needn't only be about white identity politics. It's about any racial identity politics, such as that of black identity politics too, that Paul Gilroy laid out in detail and attacked in Against Race, a book I published in the year 2000. Williams claimed to share with Nietzsche a scorn for the sorts of ideas and morality that the priestly sect of modern moral philosophers based in the academy, like Immanuel Kant and John Rawls, have devised. He believes such ideas have no good effect within society and would have negative effects if they were brought to bear and to suppress the sturdy, thick behavior of really brave human beings like Achilles. As Williams says, reflection destroys instinctual knowledge. Go with your instinctual knowledge. We have too many people going with their instinctual knowledge right now. With Williams, ethics became an ethos. In his book, Williams asks us to think about the life of the Greeks. As Roberto Colasso puts it, every notion of progress is refuted by the existence of the Iliad. This is a positive thing for Colasso. It's not a positive thing for me. Homer's people, according to Williams, don't think or reflect in Kant's sense of that word. What they do is they brood, and they are free and from silly ideas of duty. Williams scorns the silly progressivists like Kant. Williams emigrated to California for a while, where the English poet Tom Gunn had lived and admired the Hells Angels. Remember his poem, On the Move? On motorcycles, up the road they come, the boys. It's a silly mistake, says Williams, to hold Homeric shame, that Homeric shame involves slavery as to the prejudices of its community. It seems sad to me that the most brilliant English philosopher of Thatcher's England, though opposed politically to her, held the set of beliefs that she did, that he did. This is, as I said, is the identity politics of white folks. Williams thoroughly despised Kant and Rawls' political philosophy. In an essay, V.S. Naipaul describes a novel in which a young girl gives up Boston, Massachusetts to return to India and put on the veil. Williams rejected the modern world that Naipaul reveres. I was a little shaky about when I wrote this essay about Williams, so I decided to send it to somebody I knew who knew Williams very well personally, Amartya Sen. I'd read some essays of Amartya that seemed in league with what I thought, felt, and was writing. So I sent the Williams part of the Boundary 2 essay to Amartya, who wrote back and called to tell me, Lindsay, I know you know that Bernard is my dearest friend in the entire world, but you can tell him that I loved your essay and I agree with it. When I wrote and sent my essay to Bernard, the way I sent it to Rury, his essay, Bernard wrote back to me and said, I am sure that Amartya has better things to do than to read your drivel. So that was fun. Bernard was not a bleeding heart liberal. obviously. But when I sent that essay to Frank Kermode and told him about Bernard's reaction, and in words to me, Frank wrote and said this: Bernard Williams is an old friend of mine, but he has a natural intellectual arrogance which amounts to a conviction that his culture, and that of a smallish group of philosophical friends, is incompatible with the cultures of others by reason of its superior intelligence. As you observe, he writes very clearly, but there is sometimes a hint of exasperation that he needs to write for an audience slightly beyond that circle. However, my main feeling, apart from the respect for the energy and goodwill, was that so Frank testified, made me feel a little bit more comfort to lick my wounds after. I mean, Bernard Williams is a person that nobody in philosophy ever criticized because he would rip you apart in public, just because it's so easy to do, for the pleasure of it. Okay, when I think of these three cases I've told you about, I wonder if you all will condemn me for being such a perfidious publisher, or if I should condemn myself. But then I remember another particular case, David Pears's book on Wittgenstein, which was a book that was in the Modern Masters series that Frank Kermode had edited, but which had become available to put into paperback. So I was proposing it to the Faculty Board of Syndics at Harvard to do, and I sent them in testimony on behalf of the book, a review of the book by Barry Stroud in a philosophical journal, in which he spent, I think, about 20 pages ripping it to pieces. Now, perhaps that wasn't a wise idea for me to send that, to show that to the Board of Syndics, because they said, well, you've given us the evidence, so we shouldn't publish that book, because this means it's crap. And I said, oh, sorry, I should have told you. People in philosophy sometimes act differently from people in literary studies. If they think something's crap, they'll say it's good. But if they think it's bad, if they say it's bad, they'll argue with it, and then that means they love it, or at least there's a chance. Anyway, I think that's my story, folks. I think we have another speaker coming.
You have time for questions.
Oh, really? I'm going. All right. I have a piece of paper here. I can write them down. Yes.
So very interesting
I need some water.
to hear that. Great. Well, listen. So very interesting to hear this, Lindsay. The thing that it poses to me, your story of the editor who criticizes his authors, it's relatively rare for an editor to have an active intellectual life in print, other than the life of their authors. Would you reflect on that?
Certainly shouldn't have left any evidence.
I mean, it seems to me
very
that
foolish.
This is the excitement of being published by Lindsay Waters in part, namely, he's an intellectual too, not just an editor.
Yeah, but you watch out for the. Well, that was the fun for me. I mean, there wasn't any, but it was fun for me. Was it fun for Bernard?
Did your employers ever question your activity as a writer?
Oh, there was a time, just recently, and I think maybe I published that article in Boundary too. Essay about Stephen Greenblatt's book about, Swerve. Well, so it appears in Boundary 2, and Stephen Greenblatt calls up the director of the press and says, "I'm outraged. How can you have people like that publishing essays about my work?" And the director, being a very brave person, sent his henchwoman to come and tell me, "Lindsay, there will be no more reviews of you by any of our authors." So that's something like that. Otherwise.
So you're saying Stephen Greenblatt, who I think is still employed by Harvard University, interfered with your activity because you criticized a book that you weren't directly related to, and in a way threatened your job? Is that what you're saying? Just to be clear.
Yeah, well, it was threatening my job, actually, yeah. Yeah, to make clear, yes, yeah. Yeah.
It's about a litigation. Maybe not surprising, but shocking.
Well, he's a sensitive guy. We all know that.
Yeah. You know, it's funny because to me, listening to your account, because there's of course a way that editors are constantly criticizing their authors, right? And just that simple, like in this manuscript, you know, you want to change this.
Sure, sure.
And so it's interesting to me because you started off with this point about error. And it seemed to me that one thread between these three cases is that these men were kind of impervious to ever being told they're wrong. You know, they didn't want to think that they could commit an error. And so I thought this is rather interesting, especially this point about Bernard Williams when he has a kind of ironic point. He says, oh, you know, don't trust reflection, only instinctual knowledge. Well, you know, you have to be capable of reflection. You have to be capable of acknowledging an error. Yeah.
How about Lucretius? I think he had some interesting things to say about error as well. Perhaps Lucretius himself had some interesting things that perhaps Professor Greenblatt hadn't considered.
He didn't read, that's not in English literature, so. Hi.
Hi. Maybe you can share with us the next book that you're going to be attacking. Some of your authors.
Except if they're here. Especially if
Yeah, I've kind of thought about what to say to. You have to be really good for me to attack you. I'm not really interested in attacking not really challenging and interesting books.
So did you come to a conclusion as to whether you were right or wrong?
About
Well, the whole paper?
the whole paper?
Were you errant?
Yeah, I hope so. I was working on it.
Yeah, thanks very much.